She'd ridden this path 100 times, always past the same dead cottonwood tree, past the fence line half swallowed by prairie grass, past the hollow where rabbits fled from hoofbeats. But that morning, Maelen's horse stopped cold. No lurch, no spook, just a sudden halt, as if the earth itself had commanded him still. "Come on, Roan," she urged, nudging his sides. Nothing. He lowered his head and stomped once, then again, his front right hoof striking the dirt near a crooked fence post. "You're actin' foolish," she muttered, but there was something in his eyes. Not fear, not pain, something else. Insistence. She dismounted with a sigh and tugged his reins forward, but he stayed rooted. His hoof scraped again, clawing at the same spot with strange precision. Curiosity finally overtook irritation. Maelen knelt beside the post and jabbed her gloved hand into the dirt. Dry at first, then softer, then something solid. She dug faster, heart picking up, until her fingers scraped against old wood. Not splintered fencing, something built, something hidden. She brushed away the soil and saw a box, small, warped, nailed shut. Her throat tightened. She looked up at Roan, who stood utterly still now, watching. "Well, you sure wanted me to see this," she whispered. With the claw end of a rusted hammer from her saddlebag, she pried the box open. The first thing she saw was a doll, cloth torn, face nearly erased by time. Then a crumpled, rotting piece of paper folded around a rusted sheriff's badge. The paper fell apart in her hands, but not before she caught sight of a name. Her husband's name, and below it, another. "Sarah," she whispered. She didn't know a Sarah. Her husband had never spoken that name. Roan let out a low breath and stepped closer, his hoof landing gently beside the box like punctuation. Maelen felt cold all over, despite the heat rising from the dry plain. What had her husband buried out here, beside a fence no one crossed, behind a silence that had lasted years? And why did her horse, of all creatures, seem to know it was time to remember? She stared down at the box, the doll's fraying smile, the broken badge. There were things buried deeper than bones out here, and she was done riding past them. She didn't ride home. She walked Roan beside her, leading him slow as the questions stacked like storm clouds in her chest. The name, Sarah, looped in her mind like a song she never learned. Her husband, Callum, had been a quiet man, full of long silences and half-answers. She'd known he had a first wife who died before they married, but no children, he'd said. No ties left. And Maelen, widowed herself before she met him, hadn't pushed. Two souls tired of graves had found each other. No reason to dig in the past. But now a doll and a name clawed at the earth behind that fence. She placed the box on her table like it might bite. The paper was brittle and yellowed, and though most had crumbled, one corner remained folded tight. With shaking hands, she peeled it open. A few words survived. "She wasn't supposed to die there. I left her safe. I thought—" The rest tore apart like dried petals. She sat down hard. "Left who? Die where?" She stared out the window at Roan grazing calmly in the yard. That fence wasn't a random place. It was the boundary where Callum's land ended and the old county road once ran, a road long since forgotten when the new trail was carved southward. She remembered something then, years ago, at the start of their marriage. Callum had gotten drunk just once and cried into her lap about how not all things stay buried just 'cause you stop speaking them. At the time, she thought he meant war. Now she wasn't so sure. The doll, its stitching crude but careful, had the faint outline of a name, too. Tiny thread letters along the hem. S.A. not Sarah. Not quite. She grabbed an old ledger from the shelf, a marriage registry she'd found at a county auction years back. Flipping pages, she found it. Callum Bryce, 1870, spouse, Annalise Ward, daughter, Susanna Annalise. Her breath left her in a single sharp sound. S.A., not just a wife he never spoke of, but a daughter he never claimed. A daughter buried behind a fence, with nothing but a doll and silence. She rose with a sudden certainty. She had to know more. If Susanna had died, there had to be a record. If she hadn't, God help her. Maybe the grave wasn't the only secret out there. She didn't sleep. At dawn, Maelen returned to the fence with a shovel slung over her shoulder and a coil of dread tightening in her belly. Roan followed without protest, calm as if he knew what needed doing. She hadn't told a soul. Not that there were many left to tell. The nearest neighbor was half a day's ride, and the town preacher had buried more folks than he'd ever baptized. But someone needed to see what else lay beneath that earth. And to her surprise, someone did. As she approached the site, a figure was already there, kneeling, hat low, hands dusty. Sheriff Cole Remmer. Older now, gray streaking his mustache, but still with that air of unfinished justice around him. He looked up when she stepped close, his eyes unreadable. "Didn't think you'd be back so soon," he said. She stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "I buried her with Callum, years back. He made me swear not to mark it. Said it'd shame the girl's memory worse if folks asked questions." Maelen's hands curled around her shovel. "Shame?" Cole sighed. "They blamed her for her mother's death. Said she wandered off during a storm. Annalisa went looking, never came back. Susanna was 5, and he just buried her here?" she asked, voice tight. "No marker, no name." Cole stood, brushing off his knees. He didn't want her buried near town. Said she died on this land, she'd rest on this land. He built that fence the day after. Told folks it was to keep the horses in. Maelen felt the wind shift behind her, warm and dusty. "But he never told me, never said her name." "Grief makes men selfish," Cole said gently. He carried her death like a stone in his chest, drank it down, then locked it up. Maelen looked at the shallow hollow Cole had exposed, a sunken outline just past where the box had been. "I want to give her a proper grave," she said. "With a name and flowers. She deserves that." Cole nodded. "I'll bring lumber. We'll build her a marker." "And the doll," Maelen added. "It'll go with her." Roan stood watching from the shade of a tree, his ears twitching like he'd known all along what rested under this patch of earth. As Cole began digging again, Maelen sank to her knees beside him. Some things weren't meant to stay buried, especially not little girls with names no one said out loud. They worked until the sun touched the edge of the sky, carving out the resting place Susanna never had. Maelen smoothed the earth with her palms, her dress dusty and streaked with tears. The doll sat atop the mound for now, watching like a sentinel made of memory. Sheriff Cole leaned against the fence post, his silence heavy, but not cruel. "There's a woman," he said finally. "Used to be the county's record keeper. Lives up by Harlan Ridge now. Name's Miss Venzi. If anyone knows what really happened to Annalisa and Susanna, it'd be her." Maelen stood slowly. Her knees ached, her heart more so. "Do you think there's more?" "I think Callum kept too many secrets," he said, "and I think some of them deserve light." By midday, Maelen had saddled Roan and headed toward the ridge, box tied tight behind her. Miss Venzi lived in a narrow house built into the hillside, paper piled high on every shelf, walls yellowed with candle smoke. She was nearly blind, but sharp as a spade. "Susanna Annalise Bryce," Maelen said softly as she stepped inside. "Born 1870, died," her voice faltered. "Not officially," Miss Venzi said without being asked. I remember that child. She shuffled to a cabinet and pulled a worn book with curled edges. Never got a death certificate. Just vanished off the rolls. Sheriff brought in a notice but never filed it. Said the father changed his mind. Maelen's throat went tight. Why? He said it wasn't right to put it in ink. Said the land would remember her instead. Miss Venzi turned a page and tapped a line with a crooked finger. But I kept the record, just in case. The page read simply, Susanna A. Bryce. Status, missing. Presumed dead. She had a brother, the old woman added suddenly. Different mother. Left town years before Susanna was born. Name was Elias. Always caused trouble. Maelen blinked. Callum never told me he had a son. He didn't tell many. Wasn't proud of the boy. But Elias came back once. Asked about his sister. Callum chased him off. The ground felt like it shifted beneath Maelen's boots. A brother. A half-buried child. A father haunted by both. She looked down at the fragile record in her hands. This wasn't just grief. It was a wound wrapped in silence. Thank you, she whispered. Outside, Roan waited still and steady, as if knowing this ride was only the beginning. Maelen returned just after dusk. Dust thick in her lungs, the ledger pressed against her side like a holy book. She lit a lantern and placed it beside Susanna's new grave, now marked with a small wooden cross Cole had helped carve. SAB 1870-? The rest would come later. She placed the doll beside the cross, tucking its worn arms beneath a folded cloth. You're not forgotten anymore, she whispered. But as she stood, a figure emerged from the trees. Roan snorted once but didn't bolt, only shifted his weight and turned toward the stranger. The man was tall, weathered, with ash-brown hair and a rifle slung lazy over one shoulder. Maelen stiffened, one hand going to her pocket knife. Evenin', the man said, stopping just outside the lantern's glow. Name's Elias Bryce. I reckon you dug where that horse pointed. The air tightened. Maelen stepped forward slowly. You're her brother. Half-brother, he corrected, voice dry. Didn't know she was gone till I came back this week and no one would say her name? He removed his hat, eyes locked on the grave. She used to carry that doll everywhere. Wouldn't even eat without it sitting on the table. Maelen's voice was thin. Why didn't Callum ever tell me? Elias gave a bitter laugh. Callum was a proud man. Shame and silence were easier than honesty. He thought burying truth meant it stayed dead. He stepped closer to the mound and crouched beside it, fingers brushing the edge of the cloth. She followed Ma out during a storm. Ma fell into a gully trying to find her, cracked her skull. Folks blamed Susanna, said a 5-year-old had killed her own mother. Maelen's breath caught. That's why he buried her in secret. Elias nodded. But she was just a child, scared and lost. They stood in silence for a long time, the prairie wind tugging at their clothes. Then Elias said quietly, I'm not here to stir trouble. I just wanted to say goodbye proper. Maelen surprised herself. You don't have to leave right away. I made stew. He looked up at her, surprised. You're not afraid I'll bring more secrets? She shook her head. I think the land's done hiding them. And in the lantern light, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Two people who had lost the same girl, in different ways, and were finally ready to say her name aloud. The next morning, Elias was already on the porch when Maelen came outside with 2 tin cups of coffee. He nodded his thanks and sipped slow, eyes fixed on the horizon where the grave now rested, a soft mound marked by sunflowers Maelen had gathered before dawn. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them felt like respect, not distance. Then Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of oilskin. I kept this for years, he said, offering it without looking at her. Found it in Pa's saddlebag when I came back the first time. Thought it was meant for me. Maybe it was meant for her. Maelen took the bundle and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a letter, fragile and yellowed, written in Callum's sharp, practiced hand. Her eyes skimmed the lines, catching fragments between the faded creases. Susanna, if you ever read this, I want you to know I tried. I wasn't strong enough to face what folks said. I should have fought harder. I should have held you tighter when they turned their backs. You were never a shame to me. You were the only thing that made life feel decent again. Maelen blinked fast. He wrote to her, she whispered. Elias nodded. But he never sent it. Probably never meant to. Just needed to say it somewhere he couldn't be heard. Maelen folded the letter back with slow reverence and walked it to the grave. She knelt beside the mound and tucked the note beneath the edge of the doll's cloth skirt, pressing it down into the earth with her palm. He never gave her this when it mattered, she said quietly, but she can have it now. Elias watched her, his face unreadable. I think he loved her, just didn't know how to live with what happened. Maybe we're all just trying to live with what we didn't do right, Maelen murmured. Roan whinnied softly from the yard, shifting his weight. The same horse who had stopped and pointed and refused to let this truth stay buried. Maelen looked at him then, really looked, and her throat tightened with gratitude. You brought us here, she said. Elias gave a dry chuckle. Smartest one of the lot, ain't he? And this time, Maelen smiled. A small, real thing. The kind that grows in quiet soil where the dead are named and the living begin to breathe again. Word always traveled faster than the wind on the prairie, and by the end of the week, folks in town knew Maelen had dug a grave. They knew Elias Bryce was back. They knew the child no one had spoken of, Susanna, was finally resting under a cross. Some whispered. Some crossed the street when Maelen rode in for flour, but others came quietly, leaving wildflowers by the fence without saying a word. Sheriff Cole stood beside her wagon outside the mercantile one morning, tipping his hat as she loaded sacks of grain. Didn't think folks would remember her, she said. They didn't forget, he replied. They just didn't know what to do with the guilt. She glanced over her shoulder at 3 boys playing near the trough. One of them carried a doll on his back, tied with string. Her throat tightened. She was only 5, Maelen murmured. Cole nodded. That's what makes it worse. Back home, Elias was working by the fence, straightening the warped post where Roan had first stopped. He didn't say much, didn't press, just kept his hands busy as if labor could speak in place of words. Maelen approached with a basket of bread and 2 cups of cider. I want to have a gathering, she said, placing the food on the stump they used for a table. Nothing big, just neighbors, to say her name out loud. Elias paused mid-swing, hammer in hand. You think they'll come? I think they should, she said. And if they don't, I'll say it myself. He lowered the hammer and nodded once. I'll build the benches. Over the next 2 days, they prepared. Maelen tied wildflowers into bundles and set them along the path. Elias carved her name into a clean plank of wood. Susanna A. Bryce. No dates, just a name, finally spoken. On the 3rd evening, people began to arrive. Quiet, hesitant, but present. Sheriff Cole, Miss Venze, led by a neighbor boy, even the preacher, who hadn't set foot on Maelen's land since Callum's funeral. They sat on benches under the wide sky, hands in laps, heads bowed. Maelen stepped forward, voice shaking but steady. Her name was Susanna, she said, and she was loved. Even if this land was too silent to say it before, we're saying it now. And when she looked up, no one was whispering anymore. just listening, just remembering. Long after the neighbors had gone and the benches stood empty in the dusk, Maelen stayed by the grave, lantern flickering at her side. Elias sat a few paces back, hat in hand, the silence between them now familiar, less like avoidance, more like reverence. Roan grazed nearby, ears twitching, never straying far from the fence where it had all begun. Maelen reached down and lifted the doll from where it rested, its cloth faded, stitches loose. Something felt odd, like the weight wasn't quite right. Carefully she pressed along the doll's belly and found a lump. Her heart jumped. "There's something inside," she whispered. Elias leaned forward, watching as she turned the doll over and carefully tugged at a seam nearly invisible along the hem. Inside was a folded ribbon and a tiny wooden button carved into the shape of a flower. Between them, a note, nearly illegible, written in a child's uneven hand. "Papa, I made this for you, so you remember me if I get lost." Maelen's breath caught. Elias covered his mouth, eyes locked on the small piece of paper like it might vanish. "She knew," he said hoarsely. "She knew she might be forgotten." Maelen placed the note on her lap and held the doll to her chest, her eyes wet with something deeper than sadness, grief reshaped by clarity. She didn't want revenge, just to be remembered. She stood, walked to the grave, and gently tucked the note back inside the doll before placing it at the base of the new marker Elias had carved. "You don't have to make people pay to make them remember," she said. "You just have to let the truth be seen." Elias looked down at his hands, calloused and nicked. Pa carried her guilt like a wound, but he never let it heal. He just let it rot. Maelen turned toward him, her voice soft. "Then let's not do the same." The wind moved through the grass like breath, lifting the ribbon at her feet, twirling it once before laying it down flat again. It felt like Susanna's answer, a thank you, a release. Maelen knelt beside Roan as he nuzzled her shoulder. "You led me to her," she whispered. "You gave her voice." And in that moment, the fence didn't feel like a boundary anymore. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed moved gently, like water smoothing sharp stone. Maelen found herself rising earlier, walking the edge of the fence each morning, her hands brushing the tall grass as though greeting something sacred. The grave had become a part of her land. Not a wound, but a witness. Neighbors stopped by more often now, not with pity, but with quiet gestures. A fresh jar of preserves, a sack of apples, a note left folded on the porch that simply read, "She mattered." Even the children who once ran wild past her homestead began to pause near the marker, some kneeling, some whispering things to the doll, as if Susanna might still hear. Elias stayed. Not because he was asked to, but because the land itself seemed to welcome him. He took to mending the barn roof and fixing the rusted hinges on the chicken gate, working without words but with a presence Maelen hadn't realized she'd missed. At night, they shared coffee and stories, some about Susanna, others about nothing at all. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Elias stood at the fence and hammered in a final post, taller than the rest, smoother, like a monument. He turned to Maelen and said, "I want to build a bench here, so folks can sit, not mourn, just remember." She nodded, emotion caught in her throat. She'd like that. "And you?" he asked, voice softer now. "You ever think about leaving, starting fresh somewhere else?" Maelen looked out at the field, the house, the sky curling into night. "I did. For years I thought if I rode far enough, I'd outrun the ache." She paused, eyes resting on Roan grazing by the edge of the trail. "But this land remembers better than I do, and now it finally told the truth." Elias took off his hat. ran a hand through his hair. Maybe that's all a place ever needs, to be honest about what it holds. They stood in silence then, not needing to say more. The fence, once a boundary of grief and shame, now marked a path of memory and mercy. And as dusk deepened, Maelen saw what she hadn't before. Roan standing perfectly still, ears forward, as if guarding something precious. Not the grave. The story. The girl who had waited all this time to be seen. The bench was finished on the first morning of fall. Elias sanded it smooth, carved her name along the top rail, Susanna A. Bryce, and below it just one line. She was never lost. Only waiting to be found. Maelen brought out a blanket and laid it across the seat, setting a small vase of prairie daisies on the ground beneath. The wind was cooler now, brushing the grass in long waves, and the air held that sweet, aching scent of change. Roan stood nearby as always, quiet and watchful. When Maelen sat down for the first time, she didn't cry. She breathed, deep and slow, the kind of breath that only comes after silence has been broken, after names have been spoken. Beside her, Elias lowered himself onto the bench with a grunt. He stared straight ahead, hands clasped, eyes red. "I spent years hating Pa for not telling me," he said finally. "Now I think maybe he just couldn't bear to know how badly he'd failed her." Maelen nodded. But he didn't leave her behind. Not really. He left her where someone might find her someday. "And it took a horse," Elias said with a crooked smile. "A horse who stopped at the right fence and wouldn't move another inch." Maelen looked at Roan and whispered. He knew. Somehow, he knew. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher. Birds flitted along the fence line, and from the hilltop Maelen could see faint trails where wagon wheels had once rolled. The grave below them wasn't grand. No stone, no ironwork. Just a mound of earth, a cross of pine, a doll nestled in its own shadow. But it was more than enough. Because now, people came. They came to sit, to ask, to listen. Children asked who Susanna was. Mothers told them. Fathers knelt with their hats in hand. No one hurried away. One little girl brought a new doll and laid it gently beside the old one. And Maelen knew then that remembrance wasn't loud. It was steady. It was sacred. That evening, as lantern light flickered across the bench and the prairie turned to gold, Maelen pressed her hand to the wood and said it again. Not for the neighbors, not for Elias, not even for herself. For the girl. Her name was Susanna, and she was loved. And at last, the wind didn't sound like grief. It sounded like peace. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If your horse had stopped at that fence, would you have dug too?